Started. Hello everyone. I'm Parthivi Das, Executive Director of C2HR, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our final HR Learning Series for 2023. We've hosted 8 programs on a spectrum of HR topics this year. The HR Learning Series are provided free for C2HR members thanks to the generous support of our 2023 sponsors. We invite you to explore the full collection of the HR Learning Series at c2hr.org. Today's HR Learning Series is focused on the current state of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This past summer, the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling against race-conscious college admissions policies created indirect consequences for private employers. Today's fireside chat will delve into how companies are prioritizing and innovating their DEI efforts amid shifting political and public opinions. We would like today's program to be interactive and invite you to post questions and comments in the chat box throughout the discussion. SHRM has approved this learning series for 1 CE credit, and the credit code will be emailed to all participants after the event. Today's featured speakers serve on C2HR's Board of Directors. Join me in welcoming Catherine Barnett, Senior Vice President of HR at Hearst Television, and Louis Montgomery Jr., Partner of HR and Diversity Officer Search with JM Search. Catherine joined Hearst Television in 2012 and currently oversees the company's efforts in the areas of recruiting, personnel management, and employee relations, and has significantly expanded the company's efforts in the areas of diversity and military veteran recruitment. Catherine is the board chair of the Emma Bowen Foundation. Louis is the former Fortune 100 HR and DEI leader. He has personally recruited HR and DI leaders across several major sectors, including consumer, technology, business services, healthcare, life sciences, and higher education. Catherine and Louis, shall we begin the discussion?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Parthivi. It's a pleasure to be with you. And Louis, great to be with you. I'm excited about our conversation.
I am as well, Catherine. Thank you so much. And Parthivi, thank you for this wonderful opportunity.
Yes, I think this is a very relevant topic, and I know, Louis, you and I have several items we want to hit on, but maybe before we dive into some of those topics, it might be interesting for you to expand a little bit more on your background and what gives you the voice that you have right now in this arena to educate us.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. Well, I feel like I've had a very interesting career in that I've been an HR practitioner for quite some time. And after about 10 years as an HR business partner, I had the opportunity, and this was in the mid to late 90s, to work in the diversity and inclusion area. And in fact, my first title in the area was Associate Director of Affirmative Action and Diversity. And so as diversity was starting to emerge from affirmative action, I had responsibility in that area. And then later on, I took on the lead role for diversity, equity, inclusion within 2 Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies. And this was in the late 90s into the early 2000s. I've been in the search business for about 12 years, and one of the areas I specialize in is, in addition to placing human resources leaders, I've been placing diversity leaders, again, across a variety of different sectors. And so I've seen how the role has evolved. I've placed a number of folks in inaugural positions. And so I've had as I like to say, a ringside seat of the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement over the last, let's say, 30 years.
Yeah, a lot has evolved, even just the nomenclature, the monikers that we use around this space as well, I imagine.
Yes, it absolutely has.
Definitely. Well, I think our audience somewhat understands the impetus behind why we're gathered today, but I thought it would be nice if you could level set us a little bit on what was the SCOTUS decision at play.
Sure, absolutely. And while I'm no legal scholar, I'm a practitioner, as are the folks on the webinar. But I think it was a horrible decision, and I think that time will tell. Not unlike the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson, the so-called separate but equal decision that the Supreme Court made in the 1890s that ultimately has been repudiated and overturned. I think this one has that same potential. But be that as it may, that was the decision that was made, and essentially what the what the decision was made was that, and it was interesting that there's an organization called Students for Fair Admissions was the name of the organization that sued Harvard University, and it's kind of a misnomer. It is an organization run by a guy who is a well-known conservative activist. He's 72 years old. I don't think he was interested in getting into college himself, but rather he's made it his personal mission to dismantle affirmative action and diversity. And unfortunately, he got a court that was receptive to the arguments that was made. But essentially, what the decision was that the Supreme Court says that universities could no longer use race as a factor in considering admissions. Now, what's happened though, which is very narrow, but what happened in the aftermath that a lot of people may not be aware of, but it's one of the things that's caused organizations to be concerned, is that there were 13 attorneys generals, primarily from, let's call them red states, that sent a letter to Fortune 100 companies that said a couple of things. And the first thing they said was pretty incredible to me. And they said that discrimination is rampant in Fortune 100 companies. And what they meant by that was that discrimination against white people was rampant in Fortune 100 companies, which is pretty incredible if you think about the percent of women and people of color who are CEOs of Fortune 100 companies. And then the second thing they said was that discrimination is illegal federally and at the state level. And so basically they were saying, and they said, so we're watching you, is basically what they said. So it was a bit of a threat that these attorney generals made to Fortune 100 companies. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that there were 20 attorneys generals from other states that sent a letter to Fortune 100 companies in support of affirmative action and diversity. And let's say these would mostly be blue states. And they're basically saying the opposite, say, hey, stay the course. We realize that diversity is a societal imperative. We support the efforts that you're making, and basically we got your back. And so we've had the Supreme Court decision, which was again very narrowly focused, conservative attorneys generals flexing their muscle, and then let's say progressive attorneys generals across other states flexing their muscle. So it's caused this tension. Well, what do we do now as an organization? And so there's been a tremendous amount of conversation about that, which is obviously why we're having this conversation to help demystify some of what actually has happened.
Right. Well, I think that's really fascinating, especially around the tally of the attorneys generals who sent those letters. And actually, I had not heard that stat about the 20 attorneys generals who had sent letters in favor of the actions. Okay.
Sure. What I'll be happy to do as part of this, I'll be happy to provide that to our participants, both letters. It's fascinating reading.
Oh yeah, that's a great idea. I would love to see that. Now, not all of us in the audience are OFCCP companies. We're not all federal contractors, so we don't have official affirmative action programs within our employers, but we certainly have some frame of reference around what it is. Could you talk a little bit about, for those of us who aren't as familiar with what is affirmative action within the workplace, because of course the SCOTUS decision was specific to the academia college campuses. We know these things, however, don't exist in a vacuum, so that's why we're here today talking about this intersection. But could you educate our audience a bit on what is affirmative action in the workplace? Sure,
absolutely. And as I mentioned at a point in my career, after about 15 years of my career, I had affirmative action and diversity responsibility. And what my responsibility included was affirmative action plan compliance. So affirmative action is something that is included in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And what it mandates on the part of organizations who have federal contracts, and I believe the threshold is $50,000 a year or more, they are required to have a plan in place to specifically address any areas of what's known as underutilization. What that means is just very simply, let's say you've got a particular job category, let's say call them professionals. And census data says that in your local market, that 25% of the people who have that skill set are individuals of color, and let's say 50% are women. And then what federal contractors are required to do is to report on their data. So let's say if the availability is 25%, but you're only at 10%, you're considered to be underutilized. And so then what you have to do is you have to establish goals, hiring goals, and timetables to achieve those goals. And then there's an organization called the Office of Federal Contract Compliance, OFCCP, which is part of the Department of Labor, and they are responsible for monitoring contractors' progress against those plans. So organizations that are federal contract, you have to put together a formal plan, including goals and timetables. You are subject to being audited periodically by the OFCCP, and that was one of the things that I had responsibility for, was to represent the organization during those audits. And then the penalty, if an organization is considered to be egregious, or they've not made any progress over a long period of time, or there's evidence of discrimination, because they will look at what kind of applicant flow information, looking at how are women and or individuals of color being excluded. They'll look at files, and if they find evidence of discrimination, the worst thing that could happen to an organization would you would lose your federal contracts. Now, there's some organizations that have a huge amount of federal contracts. Now, here's the thing that other people don't realize, Catherine. That requirement still exists. The Supreme Court decision was just about higher education. So organizations that are federal contractors that have affirmative action plans are still subject to being audited by the OFCCP.
Okay, great. Appreciate that level set. So I'd like to go from there to explaining to us diversity, equity, inclusion. What is it? I imagine if we ask everyone in the audience, we'll get a variety of different answers. You know, how do you coin what those things are?
Sure, absolutely. And I would say that diversity, equity, and inclusion and affirmative action are cousins. I mean, they're certainly related, but again, affirmative action, as we talked about, is very narrow. It's really about representation, and it's about addressing areas of underutilization. What diversity, equity, inclusion, and now we hear the word belonging as well, it's really more about organization effectiveness. Because when we think about diversity, what diversity means it's race, gender, it's sexual orientation, it's veteran status. Everyone is encompassed, because each of us have some aspect of diversity. And so really what diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging at its core are really designed to, how do we help make sure that the workforce that we have that has some level of diversity in it is effective, that people are able to work well with each other, that there are great business outcomes, and that it's really about, again, how do we optimize and maximize the workforce that we have. And that's really what I and now B is really all about. And so it includes everybody.
Right. And I think that idea of belonging, we're hearing that more and more here. I know at Hearst, we are very focused on that idea too. It can't just be about, you know, achieving tallies and numbers on a piece of paper. There has to be that sense of belonging that we are infusing in our culture as well.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Great. And so this relationship between DE&I and affirmative action, did you want to talk a little bit more about that? Do you want to feather that out some more?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, affirmative action is a tool. I mean, it is a tool, and it's something that is mandated by the Office of Federal Contract Compliance for federal contractors, and it specifically addresses representation and underrepresentation in particular job groups. And really and it's interesting to me, Catherine, how this has emerged. When I mentioned my first title had diversity, we didn't have equity. That was not a word yet that was used. Inclusion was not a word that was utilized yet either. And then more recently, belonging. So it's over time. The early days of diversity were really about, there was a lot of, and there was some good things done. There were some things that were sort of unfortunate that were done. It was really around not just so much about really awareness. There was a lot of sort of awareness of differences, but I think a lot of damage was done because some of that training, I'd call it sort of blame and shame. Okay. And there was some unfortunate things that came out of that. But the goal was to get people to understand each other and what some of their attributes were and what some of the triggers were, so that you wouldn't unnecessarily offend somebody. I'll give you an example. that I've written a paper that I'm happy to share. It's called "What Did You Call Me?" And what it is, it's the evolution of the term Black. And just a very, very brief historical context. Post Civil War, it was appropriate and very, very common to call a Black person colored. That was a normal thing. My grandparents, my great grandparents were born around 1900. They referred to themselves as colored people. In fact, there's a wonderful organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, where the name is in there. Okay,
Right.
so color was the thing. Now, if you called a Black person colored today, they're going to look at you funny. It's like, well, what do you mean? But again, from colored came Negro. Became when I was born. I'm not going to tell you the year, but when I was born, on my birth certificate, it said Negro.
Okay.
You know, the term Negro is also, it's kind of outdated, but it's a term that was normal and used. And in fact, we've got another iconic civil rights organization, the United Negro College Fund. Later was Afro-American. We have African-American is used now, and then also Black. I prefer to use the term Black because to me it is more inclusive. Folks who are of Caribbean descent or the UK, they're not Americans, but they're Black people. And so things like that are useful as part of training, so people know what's the right way to address someone, and so that you don't offend people unnecessarily. A lot of training has been around dealing with the unintended bias that happens, and so it's really designed to kind of help people better understand each other so that we can work better together. So that's really what the goal of diversity is. And those are some of the topics that can and should be covered.
Absolutely. Here at Hearst Television, we have a dedicated DE&I leader. Her name is Yasmin Osborne. She might be in the virtual audience today. Hello, Yasmin, if you're out there. And I consulted with Yasmin before this conversation today. And so I know I've got her thoughts and voice in my head as well. But I know one thing I definitely have that Yasmin has impressed upon me is the business case for DE&I. And it's not just altruistic. And so can you talk a little bit about what is the business case? Why should employers do this, and how can it impact the bottom line, move the business forward?
Yeah, really great question. And as I mentioned, when I first got into this space, that was really the focus. It was really on creating a business case for diversity. And so you asked the question, well, what is that? It really has to do with really two things. The first has to do with the fact that our society is becoming more multicultural and more ethnically diverse. Through census data, today, half of Americans under the age of 18 are people of color. Okay. If you project into the census, by the census projections, by the year 2060, 1 in 3 Americans will be an individual of color. And so that has huge implications as to who your future workforce will be, who your future consumers, in some cases, if your kids are like mine, I've got 2 teenagers, current consumers, as well as future decision makers. And so it's a realization that, again, that if you plan to be in business in the future, if you plan to hire people, if you plan to produce products and services that people will buy, the audience that you are marketing your products to is more diverse than it was many years ago. And so that's part of it. So it's like, who's going to be your employees, and who are you going to be selling your products to? So that's part of the business case. The other part has to do with workforce effectiveness. And I'm gonna read something briefly, and it says that this was written in March of 2020. It says the business case for inclusion diversity is stronger than ever. For diverse companies, the likelihood of outperforming their industry peers on profitability has increased over time. So said another way, more diverse organizations outperform their less diverse peers over time. And then it goes on to say, and also while the penalties are getting steeper for those organizations that are lacking in diversity, Now, that was written in March of 2020 by McKinsey and Company.
Okay.
McKinsey and Company is no liberal think tank. Quite the opposite. They are really focused on business. So the business case is really around two things. It's one around your representation. Who are you going to be employing? Who are you going to be hiring in the future? And who you're going to be selling products to? But then also, how do you optimize this de facto diverse workforce, and how do you get the most out of this? So that's really what the business case is all about. Now, there's a social case as well, which has to do with equity and fairness and things like that. People can debate you and will debate you on that, and there are honest differences of opinion, but there are some immutable facts. The immutable facts are our society is becoming more diverse. It is more diverse than it was, and it will be in the future. And organizations that are more diverse outperform their peers.
Right. And, you know, it definitely seems like, you know, millennials and Gen Z, they're looking to us to, you know, start moving the needle more than we have been. And they will be, one day they will be the bosses. And what are we doing now to prepare, you know, for that day?
Yeah, exactly. And to your point, I think that millennials and Gen Z, their expectations around what organizations look like and diversity, as well as just equity and those things, are different than those of us that are, let's say, older than them, baby boomers and Generation X. So again, so it's a more diverse cohort of people coming up with expectations of more inclusiveness than in the past. And let's face it, the war for talent still exists. People vote with their feet, or in this case, they vote with their computers, because so much of us work remotely, and that people ask those questions on a regular basis. They want to know that their organization is supportive of all types of people.
Absolutely. Now, I will opine on this after you respond to it, and I admit I'm going to be a little bit biased about this question and what our thoughts are on it. But in our audience here, we've got individuals, employees who are part of an organization who have a dedicated DEI role within the ranks, and then those who don't have that. You know, should an organization have a dedicated DE&I leader?
I think yes, and I'll caveat that. I think the ultimate answer is yes, but I think part of it has to do with size of the organization. A 100-person organization, I think, would be difficult for them to have a dedicated DE&I leader. But I think once you get into the 1,000+ and multi-thousand, it just makes it, if this is, because really what DE&I and belonging are really about is about organizational change. That's ultimately what it's about. It's about culture change. It's about evolution. And there are people like Jasmine in your organization and others that have real expertise in this area. Not so much when I first started back in the 90s. It was a new field. But I think and I would answer it this way, and I'd love your thoughts as well. If this is something that's really important for you as an organization, it makes sense to have someone focused on this, not unlike you have somebody focused on total rewards or talent management or labor relations if you have unions in your organization. It's a real expertise, and it's an area that as we see from this conversation, is fraught with challenge. And having someone with expertise in this area is only going to help to accelerate your efforts. So that's my 2 cents. Love your thoughts too, Catherine.
Yeah, you know, I think at Hearst Television, we had certainly been making strides towards being a more diverse and inclusive organization. Absolutely. And on our own, we were doing some things, but we wanted to really make, you know, more of an impact. And when we created this role, this was in 2021 that we created this role for a dedicated DE&I leader, and this is the turbocharge we were looking for. And so now with Yasmin in her role, she's got this unreserved focus on all things DE&I, under her leadership, we've been able to launch employee resource groups, for instance.
Mhm.
I wasn't going to be able to get that done on
Sure.
my own. And on our HR team in general, we all wear a lot of different hats, and we weren't going to be able to focus on it on our own. I've got some of our branding of our employee resource groups behind me on the wall
Mhm.
here, and I couldn't have done this by myself, and I don't have the expertise that she brings to the table. And so our commitment as an organization, especially coming out of the summer of 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, is that this can't be a moment in time. And yes, there is, heartbreak that came out of that, but there was also momentum, and we want to seize that momentum and keep it going. And with Yasmin in this role, she's holding her feet to the fire. She's keeping us moving forward and focused on this. If we didn't have a dedicated professional in his capacity, I know what the reality is. We get pulled in so many different directions on a daily basis that we wouldn't have made the progress that we've made so far with, all of our initiatives towards being a more diverse, more inclusive, more equitable organization. So I don't know how in our organization, we've got over 4,000 employees. And so I think we hit that kind of like definitely go past that critical mass of like, yeah, it makes sense to have a dedicated resource there. What would you say to someone in the audience who might be in an employer where they're at that tipping point of likely needing someone like this, and they're going to come out of this conversation that we're having, and we're going to have stoked their fires around making, a pitch to their leadership. What might they say to their leadership about why they should consider creating this type of role?
Yeah, that's a great point. I'd say for a couple of reasons. If especially if you are in a consumer facing organization, as all of our members are. If you're a railroad, less so. But the fact that, as we talked about before, from a business case standpoint, who are your customers? Who will your employees be in the future? Who are the decision makers going to be in your organization? So, I mean, so if you're in any sort of consumer facing type of organization, you absolutely should, again, caveat based on once you get to a critical mass type of size. And I'd say the second point is that it's really important that senior leadership really ultimately owns this. I've been fortunate I've placed a number of diversity officers across, again, different organizations in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd being killed. There was a tremendous interest in a number of these positions. There were more DNI positions than there were DNI practitioners. It was a bit of a gold rush. A lot of people moved around. Some of those people have stuck. I placed 5 people in that time period. 4 of the 5 are still in their roles. 1, unfortunately, is not. But the key thing is really around senior leadership support. And again, if your senior leadership views this as a business imperative, you got traction. If they view it as a social imperative, I'd say watch out, because the social comparative, and I think it's both, but I think that, again, that could be more dependent on who's sitting in the chair.
Right.
A senior leader could say, I view this as this is part of social justice, which it is, and they're embracing it on that basis. But let's say that senior leader changes. In the one instance where someone I placed is no longer in that position, that's what happened. There was a new senior leader, and that senior leader said, it's not a priority for me. And unfortunately, my placement was negatively impacted, but the others have been solid. The other thing I'd say, Catherine, is I've written extensively on this, and I've on my LinkedIn page, there is a link to a paper that I wrote and published earlier this year called The Evolving Role of the Chief Diversity Officer, where I interviewed 5 DE&I leaders across different types of organizations: healthcare, life sciences, business services, and technology. And 3 of those 5 I placed in their inaugural positions. The others were already there. There's some real insight that you can get from them as how the role has evolved, because I wanted to look at how's the role different post George Floyd, obviously, but then even pre-George Floyd.
Right. Agreed.
Yeah.
And talking about the summer of 2020, and as you said, there were a lot of DE&I leadership roles that were posted and filled, and it does seem like it's a little alarming when you dig in on some of the news that some employers have, as you said, backed away from commitment around these endeavors and these initiatives. I know here at Hearst, we're staying the course. We are not backing away from any of this. And I know what would you say to an HR professional who's in the audience today who feels like their organization has lost some of the focus on the momentum, and they have moved away from some of those commitments that they had made only months ago?
Yeah, I think you got to ask the question. So why did you get into it? Why was a position created? Again, because in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's being killed, I mean, we were all horrified at what happened, and a lot of organizations that we talked about that we need to have a position like this without a lot of thought necessarily in preparing the organization. So that's the question. Well, what kinds of things can we do to raise the visibility of this? So really getting back to the question as to why was this important to us during the summer of 2020? But even more importantly, do we see this as something that's going to be important for us in the summer of 2025 and beyond? So to me, it comes back to the business case. Or is this a business imperative? And then it's really a check-in with senior leaders as well. If they sponsored these kinds of this kind of initiative, to ask, why?
Well, it seems like too, being able to pull on the lever of being proactive, and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and we want to be as prepared as possible for that moment and not feel reactive, coming out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And one that you mentioned, Catherine, and I certainly have the experience as well, has to do with employee resource groups. And in the organizations one of the organizations that I worked in, where I had my first DE&I role, the employee resource groups, they were called affinity groups back in those days, existed before there was a DE&I role and strategy. Because these groups, which have evolved to become employee resource groups, and some organizations call them business resource groups, started out as sort of groups of people that had some characteristics in common, and they banded together for their mutual aid and support. And so even if you don't have an initiative, you may have people that have somehow found each other and are looking for ways in which to move things forward. And so if you can't have a full-blown initiative or position, start small. So one of the things that you do is you work with people and organizations where they are, and find out what their pain points are, and begin to work from those.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Yasmin and I've talked about BRGs, business resource groups, and if we're ready for that. We're not ready for that yet here within Hearst Television, but she's kind of starting to dimension what could that be and what would be the value add if we were to head in that direction. But it is a bit of an evolution to go from an affinity group, ERG, and then to BRG, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I'd say is there's a lot of literature out there around DE&I. There's folks like me that have got a lot of experience in this area, that I've placed leaders. So I certainly would be thrilled to help any of our member companies that don't yet have a DE&I leader to talk about, does it make sense? Where should the job report? What are the characteristics? How do you make this a success if you ultimately go down that path? And one of my clients, and one of the folks who's interviewed as part of the paper, they contacted me in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd being killed and said, we want, and they were a multi-thousand organization, and they're like, we need to do something. But what they decided to do, which was very smart for them, is instead of saying we're going to start a search for a DE&I leader, they said we're going to prepare our organization first. And they did a lot of work with their senior leaders and others to really better understand where people were. They sort of created their own business case as to this. And then a year and a half after that, they said, okay, we're ready now. We're ready to do a search. and we did a search, and the person has landed in the organization and is doing great because, again, they prepared the organization. It's not unlike, if you're part of the analogy, it's not unlike farming. You don't just put seed on the ground. You have to prepare the ground to accept the seed. And
Right.
so that's what the smartest organizations are able to do. And like I said, this organization started from absolute scratch, and it's going
Wow.
extremely well.
It's great. I've got some more questions to go over, but I want to remind the audience that if you would like to submit your question to us, please do so in the chat, and we're happy to address your questions as well. So my next question for you, going back to the DE&I leadership role,
Mhm.
when you think about who that person could report to within the organization, there's a lot of different options there. What are your thoughts around the best practice around who that individual should report to?
Yeah, I think that, and there are clearly variations. And sort of the three major variations are reporting to the chief executive of the organization, which is not common. That's only like 39% of the time. Reporting to the head of HR is more common, or reporting to, let's say, the head of talent. As I am advising clients as they think about those, and I've placed people that reported to the CEO of their organization. I've also placed people who report to heads of HR, and I've also reported people who report to heads of talent. To me, the optimal place is the head of HR. The reality is, I think while it looks good and it sounds good that this person reports to the CEO, the reality is most CEOs don't have the time, honestly, to
Yeah.
be able to devote to this kind of organizational change initiative. Now, the CEO should not be on the sidelines. The CEO needs to be seen as a champion and being a big part of this initiative. But the reality is they don't really have time. Most of the work is really HR work. It's about culture change. It's looking at who's being hired into the organization, who's being promoted, who's being developed, what's the organizational culture like, what's the level of engagement that exists within the organization. Those are all HR um, uh, pieces that need to be, that should be considered. So that's ideal. Less ideal, but can be effective as well as being part of the talent organization. The challenge is you want the person to be senior enough and seasoned enough to be able to stand their ground, to make to speak truth to power, as people say, and they should also have access to unfettered access to senior people within the organization, because part of this role is advisory. So that's the ideal place in my experience.
And I promise that I know we had some pre-conversation, Lewis, but I was so happy to hear that was what your guidance was going to be, because that's what we've got going on here. And Yasmin reports into me, and I'm the head of the HR team. And it actually was new for her to report into the HR structure as compared to her prior employer. So we've had a lot of fun educating her on all things HR.
Sure.
But I think you're absolutely right. And we actually just yesterday, Yasmin and I had a really substantial meeting with members of our diversity council, internal diversity council, and we talked about how time is our enemy. And so the idea that this individual is going to be reporting into the president, the CEO, that's going to be really tough, because that person just has limited amount of time. Now, that doesn't mean that Yasmin doesn't have her own relationship with our president, in my case, and I don't have to broker that for her. I don't have to shepherd that for her. She has a direct line, direct access to him, and has, in some cases, meetings just with the two of them. I'm not part of it, which I love and adore, because I think that's as well demonstrating commitment from that CEO presidency, back to us, that like they are invested in this, but they just realize they need to have some division of labor around how the structure is. Definitely. I do have a few more questions. So we have a question from the audience from MJ. This question is, we are ready to expand our diversity initiatives. What would be your first step in locating diverse candidates with experience?
Okay. So I guess is a question about, I guess you said by expanding your diversity initiative, are you talking about having more diversity in your candidate pool, or creating a position that would have overall responsibility for diversity? It sounds like the former versus the latter. What do you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes,
No,
more
it is.
diversity in candidate pools.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, excellent. Well, wonderful question. I'd say a couple of things, and I've written extensively on this subject as well, and I believe I've got a link to a paper that I wrote, published earlier last year, called "3 Strategies to Improve Diversity in Your Candidate Pools." And the first is looking in some non-traditional sources. And what I mean by non-traditional sources is that, sometimes it's difficult to identify folks who may be individuals of color. One of the non-traditional sources that organizations can use are something called the Divine Nine. And what the Divine Nine are there are 9 Black fraternities and sororities. I happen to be a member of one, the first one, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. We just had our 117th Founders
Wow.
Day yesterday, in fact. So that's a way to identify individuals. Clearly, there are, and I don't know the exact number, but there are dozens of historically Black colleges and universities. There are dozens of Hispanic serving institutions. There are lots of organizations that have very high Asian population. So it's targeting, if you're looking at recruitment at the university level, targeting places like that. So that way, imagine if you recruit at a Hispanic serving institution or an HBCU, you're going to see a lot of candidates and get to choose from the best of those, as opposed to if you're only recruiting at predominantly white institutions, you might only see 1 or 2 individuals of color in the course of a day, and so you don't really have choices. So those are a couple of things that you can do as well. And then there are all kinds of associations that exist that are organized around ethnicity, as well as around gender. There's the National Hispanic MBA Association. There's an Asian, there's a SIN, there's the National Black MBA Association. So there are all kinds of organizations, and then there are organizations that are even within some of the specialized areas of specialized sectors. So again, there's lots and lots of these types of groups that are out there, and you got to do research to find them. But grab a copy of my paper. I go into this in a bit more detail, but you have to be very intentional. The other thing, though, that's very important, and I talk about this in the paper as well, is you have to make sure that that once you found a more diverse pool, that you don't have unintended systemic bias that is excluding people from getting through the process. And so you've got to look at do analysis of success rates of people from the top of the funnel all the way through to offer. And if you're finding areas in which individuals are being excluded at a rate higher than you think they should be, zero in on that. Implicit bias is something that is real. We all have it, and it's something that we have to work very hard to combat.
Absolutely. I really like hearing that. Oh, we got a new question from Melissa. Do you believe that the recent rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim discrimination are going to fuel employers' focus in workplace DEI in 2024?
Yeah, great question. I think so. And I think it just shows just how fragile, frankly, relationships can be. I mean, let's face it, and I'm again, I'm not a legal scholar, nor am I a political scholar, but obviously there's been long-term issues and challenges in the Middle East, and unfortunately, those have manifest with the very unfortunate invasion of Israel and the aftermath of that. And so, yeah, I think so. I think again that that religion is a important aspect of diversity, and clearly there's a lot more conversation now about religion, about anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim feelings as well. So no, and the reality is organizations, as we know, we don't get to people don't check their identities at the door. They bring their identities into work, and things that happen outside of work has implications inside of work. So I think that's going to make things continue to make things challenging for organizations. How do you navigate? How do you navigate between very, very complex, long-term issues that are real in our workforces.
Right. Someone asked about the name of your article. Karen asked, and then MJ jumped in to provide a link to your article. Great, thank you, MJ, for answering that. Louis, something else that's on my mind is we've talked about here at Hearst Television. How will we know when we're successful in our achieving our strategies and maintaining them? And I appreciated what the guidance and thoughts that Yasmin had around. We'll know when it's not something extra. It's not something special that, you know, we're doing off the side of our desk sort of thing. It is woven into the fabric of who we are as an employer. I'm interested in your reaction to that. And then my follow-up to that is we've wondered and we've been thinking about, should we have mandatory DE&I training similar to our mandatory training around security awareness? You know, we've all turned into like, I'm a human firewall. Our employers have done that to us. We were not like that. You know, society and our employers have done that to us. And so now we're very cautious about what we click on within the workplace. And our employers are like sending us, you know, an annual training or, you know, some phishing tests throughout the year. That all helps us build that muscle memory and have this, you know, I've got my alert up. I'm not going to let my guard down. And so we've seen our employers change our behavior for the better with regard to that. So we've wondered about, should we be infusing some sort of mandatory training like that into the workplace around DE&I? I don't know, just thoughts on those topics?
Yeah. Well, I think with respect to the first question, how will you know you're successful? And it's a journey. You know, as I said at the very beginning, I first got in this space in the mid and late 90s. And some of the same issues that we're grappling with today are issues that we were grappling with then, because part of this are societal issues. And so I expect that 10 years from now, that some of the topics that we're stressing about now may be different. Maybe more, maybe there may be other kinds of things that we'll be focused in on. So, but it's a journey. But I tell you, here's one way you'll know when you're successful. And I had this experience, and I'll mention the name of the organization because I have great respect for them. The first organization that I worked in the DE&I space was with Kraft Foods. And Kraft Foods, again, is a iconic consumer brand, well thought of, and not just in terms of the products, but also in terms of the workforce. It's now Kraft Mondelez, two different organizations. But you know, I was I had moved on from there. I had left the Kraft Foods organization. I was with another organization, and I had an opportunity to go back for a meeting. And the CEO of Kraft Foods, who was a woman, and I'll mention her name because I have great respect for her as well. Her name is Betsy Holden. And she was doing a presentation on the state of the business. And one of the things she was talking about was how proud of the diversity work that they were doing. And she was talking about statistics. And I remember sitting in the audience and getting chills that here was the senior most leader of the organization. And a big part of her presentation was how the organization was doing from a diversity, equity, and youth diversity standpoint. So when your leaders start to lead and they start to provide information like that, that's when you know you've really got through to them. So that's a way to know.
Love that.
Yeah, you know, with respect to should there be some sort of training, I say the answer is yes, because I'm a person, I believe in not leaving things to chance, and I think that absent overt discrimination, absent implicit bias, we wouldn't need any of this. The reality is discrimination, implicit bias is part of the human condition. It is. We're not going to change the human condition, but what we can do is we can make people more aware of biases and help to minimize those kinds of things. So I think, yes, if ultimately you want to have a different conversation 5 years from now than the conversation we're having today, yeah, if you want to make progress in this area, it's not going to just happen automatically. You know, there has to be systems. You have to have a strategy. You have to have skilled professionals within your organization. like Yasmin and others. You have to have senior leadership support, and you ultimately, because this is a societal workforce issue, you have to have people on board, and people need to be more skilled in working with their colleagues. And I think, yes, I think training makes a lot of sense, but again, the right kind of training that meets people where they are, that is not shame and blame, that's really about how can you be more effective at doing this. Because again, this is long-term organizational change. You know, we're coming up on the beginning of next year. A lot of us are going to have New Year's resolutions, and for a lot of people, a New Year's resolution is to lose weight. Now, most people don't make their New Year's resolutions last through about the end of January, but those people that put together a plan are much more likely to be successful. And so to me, that's how you not leave things to chance, by having a plan, doing training, and training is a piece of it. It's really more than that, but it's really about, again, having a long-term strategy to address this very, very important area.
And it seems like we have to be brave. We've got to be courageous. And we've got to be open to uncomfortable moments and experiences and conversations, and that can be hard to exist in those uncomfortable spaces.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I'm glad you said that. Another paper I wrote a few years ago when I was with a different organization than I'm with now, and this is also available on my LinkedIn page. I was with Korn Ferry at the time. I'm with JM Search now, and myself and two colleagues, we had a theory, and the theory was that diversity officers who were more effective, who were the rock stars versus those people who were mediocre. We felt we wanted to see, were there some different attributes or competencies that those, we called them next generation chief diversity officers had. And we did some analysis, and we had data from evaluation, from assessments on these folks, and we determined that there were differences. And you mentioned one of the differences, one of the leadership attributes that we found to be the case in most highly effective diversity officers was courage. Because again, this is hard work. This is about speaking truth to power. This is leaning against the wind in some cases. So courage is a very, very important attribute. We also saw that persuades, the ability to be influential, because again, it's not about position power. It's about how can you be influential, as well as being collaborative. So yeah, those are, courage matters a lot for HR people, and it matters a lot for diversity professionals as well.
Take courage, everyone. So in our remaining couple of minutes here, Louis, we started the top of this talking about the disappointment and the alarm around this SCOTUS decision. Can you leave us with encouragement and fuel our courage as we go into 2024 with your thoughts?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm an optimist. To me, it doesn't make sense to be much of anything else. If you're not an optimist, why get out of bed? So I'm an optimist. I'm also an optimist because, again, I've seen how things evolve. I think we're dealing with a point in time. Let's face it. I started by saying I thought the decision was wrong. The decision is the decision. The Supreme Court will change, as it always does. But more importantly, I think that the decision is really out of step with the reality of our society right now. Most people within our society, a majority of people, value diversity and inclusion. So to me, it's really about staying the course. Yeah, there are probably some refinements that you might need to do as an organization, but the reality is your consumers are going to continue to hold your feet to the fire, as well as your employees are going to hold your feet to. So people want this. There is way more support for this, for DE&I and belonging, than there is opposition. The opposition can be very loud and quite noisy, but just like I said, there were 12 attorney generals that were said that were supportive of the decision, but there were 20 that we're not. So you have just numerically, you have a lot more, there's a lot of support for this, but you have to be thoughtful and you have to be strategic. I'll quote my fraternity brother, Dr. Martin Luther King, and he said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Oh, I like
And I
that.
believe that. And so I believe that, again, I think about where we've come as a society and where we're going as a society. So I think that, again, this is a point in time. This is an inflection point. But again, I think that the momentum still exists. We've got to be thoughtful about how we work this. But again, it goes back to the business case. It's like you're more effective as an organization. The more diverse you are, you're going to be more effective. And your consumers are more diverse than they were, and they will be more diverse in the future as well. Your employees will be.
Wonderful. Wow, hard to top that, and especially the quote from Martin Luther King. And we're going to bring Parthavi back on stage to help us wrap up.
Well, first of all, I think, like you said, Catherine, I mean, Louis, what a wonderful way to end this conversation. And thank you both so much for sharing your insight. As you said, it's a point in time. So our conversation on this is going to be continuing, just because we all know that diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging will always be part of our dialogue in the C2HR community. So for those of you who attended today, thank you so much. As you can see right now, your education, your CME credit is on the screen. And we will be emailing you this information plus the recorded version of the webinar later in the week. Again, Catherine and Louis, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you all our C2HR community for being a part of our HR learning series this year. And we look forward to seeing you again in January when we have our kickoff for 2024. So thank you, everyone, and hope you all have a wonderful day.
And happy holidays, everyone.
Yes, happy holidays. Thank you, everybody. Thanks. Bye-bye.